Welcome to Dream Week San Antonio, Dream Week SA 2021. I am Mateen Diop, and I'm going to be presenting today on my story called The Descendants. I am in the year that we've just had in 2020, and we can kind of continuing to go through this whole COVID pandemic. I am so honored and blessed and privileged to still be a part of the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his life and legacy, and that's what we're doing right here at Dream Week SA. Again, my name is Mateen Diop, and I'm going to be talking about my descendancy, where I come from here in the city of San Antonio, Texas. And I believe we all have a story to tell, and I would encourage you, as I go through my presentation, I would encourage you to think about your story and think about what you would like to tell our community moving forward. So again, my name is Mateen Diop. And so some of you might be watching this going, he looks familiar, but his name was not Mateen. And that's very true. I grew up here in San Antonio, Texas. I was born in June 19th to be exact. And those of us who know anything about history, we know June 19th is also Emancipation Day. I was born to a family, a blended family. There were 12 of us. My stepfather had 6 children. My mother had 6 children. So we were all blended together, and I was the youngest of all 12 of those. From my recollection, really only grew up with about 6 in my house. But my hero, my oldest brother, I call him, we call him Lefty in the streets, but his name is Edward. That is my hero. Then I have John. Then I have Norman. Then I have Jackie, Elsie, Mavis. Those are all my siblings on my mother's side. Those are the ones that I grew up with, and I have so much fondness for. I have fondness for all my brothers and sisters, but those 6 in particular, those 5 in particular, are the ones who really shaped my life. And as you can see, in my slide here in the presentation, you see as a little boy, as a very little boy, I was always curious about the adults in my neighborhood, always curious about the adults in my home. So you can see I was probably 4 years old right here when everybody in my house smoked cigarettes. So I said, what is this cigarette thing all about? So I didn't really light it, but my mother happened to capture that picture of me smoking a cigarette. And then the next picture, my sister, Mavis. She and I are like peas in a pod. I actually wrote a book called Inner City Public Schools Still Work, and I dedicated chapter 2 to not to memory, but to our growing up together and the things my sister had to endure as a young person. And then I graduated from Highlands High School here in San Antonio, and for a time I spent a little time at Alamo Heights Middle School, and then I was fortunate to have a little baby. Her name is Yasmin now, and then I joined the military. But what I really want to point out to you here is this man. I'm told his name is Stacy, I believe. He's my grandfather on my father's side. And if you know anything about fatherlessness in the inner city, a lot of us didn't have fathers growing up. I had a stepfather. So I never met my actual father. I never met him. But I'm told that's his father, my grandfather. And when I saw this picture, I thought to myself, wow, that's what I call my grandpa. I've never had an opportunity to call anybody grandpa on my father's side, so I thought it was so cool that I actually have a grandfather on my father's side that I can be proud of. And that's him. So I said I have to include him, and I have to talk about him in this presentation. So he's my grandfather on my father's side. What I want you to understand about my descendancy and about my life, it is steeped in, it's interspersed with what I call the color of law. If you've never read this book by Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, I would encourage you to read it. It's a very interesting book because it talks about segregation and how living patterns and all those things were federally approved, state approved, and local approved. So you might say, well, what does that have to do with your descendancy? Well, it has everything to do with my descendancy because I grew up here in San Antonio on the east side of town. And if you know anything about the east side of town, historically, it's always been the black side of town. And even on the east side of town, there were pockets of real deep poverty. Those places where we live were called federal housing projects. They were designed to keep black people living here, Hispanic people living over here, white people living over here. It was designed to keep everybody separated, keep us in our place, so to speak. So I lived in a place called the East Terrace. Now, the picture you see here are the Wheatley Courts, but they're all federal housing projects. But I grew up in a place called the East Terrace when I was a little boy. So I grew up there, and if you know anything about growing up in a federal housing project, you know that there's Everybody there pretty much makes around the same amount of money, which is next to nothing. Everybody. Everybody there is poor. Everybody has the same mentality. We're all fighting for the same crumbs. So that leads to a lot of crime. And as I got older, you see drugs start to infiltrate our communities, and then these projects got worse and worse and worse. As I grew up and I saw these things as I was growing up in these neighborhoods, it was the funniest thing because I wasn't afraid to walk through my own neighborhood. My friends and I would walk through the East Terrace, the Sutton Homes, the Wheatley Courts. We would walk through these projects all the time when we were little. We had no idea that we were supposed to be afraid. To us, that's just our neighborhood. That's just where we grew up. But as federal law began to come under pressure for what they call concentrated poverty, they had to get rid of these federal housing projects. Even on the west side of town, Cassiano Homes, Alazan Apache Courts, they're all separated, segregated by race and income. Even on the east side of town, if you were black and you could afford to live in a home and you didn't have to live in the projects, you still had to live on the east side of town. The wealthiest enclave of black people that I remember growing up lived in a place called Willowwood. They still live there to this day. Or they live in Delcrest. Or they live off of W.W. White Road in East Houston. There are places for them to go, but we were all still on the east side. It didn't matter that you were a colonel in the United States military. You still, because you were black, you still had to live on the east side of town. So again, as I mentioned, that as the federal housing and segregation came under scrutiny, President Obama actually came up with a solution to get rid of what he called concentrated poverty. And the popular term now is gentrification. So where I grew up, here in the Wheatley Courts in the East Terrace, this is what it looks like now. Through gentrification, they were all torn down. Single family homes. Let's disperse the residents and bring in these single family homes to make sure that we don't have this pocket of concentrated poverty and get rid of the things that are associated with poverty. Fatherlessness, crime, those types of things. Is it working? Yet to be discovered, but that's what happened. So the projects that I grew up in are no longer there. So let me go back a little bit to my descendancy story. As again, I told you my name is Mateen Diop. I wasn't born Mateen Diop. When I was born in June 19th, my mother named me Milton Potter. That's the name that's on my birth certificate. That's the name that's on my high school diploma. As I was growing up, going through the things that we went through, somewhere along the line, I started to understand that maybe this is not my true identity. I was named after my father, I'm told. The father that I never met. The father that had nothing to do with how I was being raised as a young man. But I was yet named after him. And somewhere along my descendant journey, or somewhere along my path, I decided that I don't think I want to pass that name, Potter, I don't want to pass that name on to my child. And at the time when I made this decision, I didn't have any children. But I said, if I'm ever so blessed to have a child, the name Potter would die with me. So if you look at my high school diploma, has Milton Potter on there. If you look at my college diploma, my bachelor's degree from the University of Incarnate Word, it has Milton Potter on there. If you look at my military records, when I first joined the military, it had Milton Potter. But again, in 1998, I decided I no longer want to carry that name. But what name should I choose? Was the question. What name should I choose? At that time, I was studying the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I read his story. I was enthralled. I was completely enamored by his book. And I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to change my last name to X. So I did that informally. I was Milton X. But then I knew I couldn't live my entire life with an unknown as my last name. So I had to find a name. So if you know anything about the cultural journey of black people in America, I read hundreds of books. I studied, I visited other places, talked to other people who had changed their name and say, why did you choose the name that you chose? And the answers varied. So I had to choose for myself. So I found a book on African names. And I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to open the book, and on one side of the book are names. On the other side of the book are the meanings of the names. So I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to open the book and cover up the names, and I'm going to go down the attributes of each name. So I did that. I opened the book, covered up the names, and I went down the line. I said, strong, firm. Yeah, that's me. What's that name? Mateen. That's going to be my first name. I kept going down the list. One who submits to God. Yeah, that's me. I submit to God. What's that? Ajala. That's my middle name. Kept going. Saw ruler, teacher, scholar. Went to the name Diop. That's me. So I went down to the courthouse and I decided I'm going to be Mateen Ajala Diop. Or as it's really pronounced, Diop. It's spelled D-I-O-P, but the D sounds like a J. So I made up my mind. Nothing was going to change me. People say, well, what is your mother going to say? And at that point, my honest answer was, I didn't care what anybody thought. I'm going to keep the name and I wanted a name that connected me to somewhere in Africa. That's where Diop came in. That's where Diop came in. Diop is a Senegalese name from East Africa. And one of my favorite authors is Cheikh Anta Diop. That was his last name. So I thought it was really, really fitting that I just happened to choose his last name since he was my favorite author anyway. And I had no idea that I was going to choose his name. So that's what I did. I closed the book, wrote down all the names, and immediately went to the courthouse. Courthouse gave me all the paperwork I needed. I left the courthouse, the judge signed, my name is changed. I ran out of the courthouse, went right across the street to the federal building, got me a new Social Security card. And you don't get a new Social Security number, just a card with a different name. I ran across to my employer, changed my name over there. I went to the driver's license office, got a new driver's license. Now I'm set, now I'm a new person. Now my name, Mateen Ajala Diop, it connects me to Africa. It connects me, in this particular instance, it connected me directly to Senegal. I had never been to Senegal. Honestly, I've never even traveled to Africa. I'm gonna go one day. I've just never been there. But one thing I knew about the power of a name is that when you talk to someone with a Hispanic surname or a French surname or a Russian surname or even an African surname, it connects them to a landmass somewhere. And the name that I had connected me somewhere that I had no idea about. So when I chose my name, it connected me to a place that I can say, that's my home right there, even though I've never been. And that's the story of my name. When we moved out of the projects, we moved into a little house on Amanda Street. That still stands to this day. It was a shotgun house. When I said shotgun house, I mean that meant that you can stand at the front door right here, shoot a double-barrel shotgun, and the shots would go all the way through the back door and out the house without touching anything in the house. A shotgun house. It was just one long house. That's where I grew up, on Amanda Street, 78210 on the east side. Everything I learned about being whatever you want to call it, a man, or just learn my street ways, I learned here in this house. I graduated from Highlands High School in 1982, and what I want to bring to your attention is what we were called when we were in high school. See? We were called Negroes, and that was my name. I was Milton Potter, a Negro. I was a high school graduate, but a Negro. That's something that I needed to shed. Negro, it just means black. I'm like, I know I'm more than black. I have to be. But that's how the country saw me. That's how my high school saw me. And of course, my grades reflected all of that. Some of the worst grades you could possibly imagine. So what I want to leave you with is this. As we're growing up, as young African-American men, as older African-American men, as we're growing up in society, believe that you can accomplish whatever you want. For me, it started with my name. It started with my community. It started with growing up in segregated housing. That's how it started. That's what shaped me. It started with me watching my big brother do all that he did and wanting to emulate him. To get to me where I was when I got to high school and had all the worst grades you can see. But to eventually believe that I could do anything I put my mind to the point where I ended up earning a doctoral degree. To where I ended up becoming a high school principal. I was the high school principal in the very parking lot that I used to sleep in when I was growing up. That's the power of belief. That's my descendancy story. And your descendancy story needs to be told. Do not take your story to the cemetery because we need to hear it. That's my story. I appreciate you listening, and we will see you next year. Thank you. Peace.